All right, good morning, some of you. How you guys doing this morning? It is good to see you. It is good to be with you. As Erin just said, we had our summer XP camp this week, and so for those of you, as she said, volunteered, who gave to provide a scholarship, it was just a fun time seeing the kids learn different skills as they learn different sports, but ultimately heard about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for them. And then at the end of the week, we hosted like a little hot dog luncheon for all the families that came. And it was really cute to see all the kids who made friends over the week, then like introduce their parents to their friends and then had the parents meet. And you just saw all these like fun little like connections being made throughout the week. So it was a great opportunity for our church kids to develop their relationships, hear about Christ. And then even, as Erin said, a few students believed in Jesus, and even one of the students that came was just invited by a friend. They didn't necessarily have a church affiliation to begin with, but now they do because they came to be a part of that camp. So thank you for those of you who were praying and those who gave towards it and just helped our families be cared for. Second thing before we jump into our text this morning is earlier this year we talked about our elder and our pastor applications being open for those who are interested in maybe pursuing the office of pastor or elder here at Some of You Church. And just want to remind you that those are always open, and we invite those who are covenant partners who've maybe felt the call in their life to maybe pursue pastoral ministry or be an elder in the church. Something that we're going to start doing this fall is all these individuals that are putting in for applications saying, I want to do this. We're going to host a little cohort for some training for the next year that'll go over theological development, practical ministry skills, and just building a relationship with those people who are interested in maybe pursuing pastoral ministry. So if that's you're a covenant partner, we would invite you to consider applying for that. It'll start this fall. I know some of you have already applied in the past. I will be following up with you shortly of what that looks like, but we just want to say, if you've ever been interested, now would be a great time to consider it, start the conversation. Or if you're ready to apply, you can always go to summitview.net/elders, and the application is live there. So today we are in Proverbs week 3, and we're going to be in chapter 3 to start with. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn there with me. So Proverbs, we're studying this summer, as we've been looking at so far, because we want to receive wisdom from God. We as Christians believe that God is the one who created the universe, who created everything here. And so there's a particular design for how things are to go and how things are supposed to operate based upon God's design. However, we do know that this world is broken because sin has entered into it, not just by decisions years and years and years ago, as we see in Genesis chapter 3, but even decisions that you and I make that add to the brokenness of this world, and that we have hard times with all areas of our lives. So we looked at first week of wisdom, last week the problem that we often have with our speech, the way that we talk. This week we're going to look at money, and future weeks we're going to look at other things that are important and impactful to us. What is God's design and what he would want us to do with these things? So the Proverbs that we see today that we're going to look at will provide instruction, might even give some discipline, but give us insights to this topic that we're going to look at today, and that topic is money. So our hope is, as we approach the scriptures today, that we would hear from God, speaking to what is often one of our most common idols, things that we want to worship or things that we'll want to pursue more than God, or maybe source of our greatest fear because of maybe we didn't have a lot, maybe we don't have a lot, and there's a lot of uncertainty tied to that. Or we also know that a lot of stress within marriages and within relationships, or just personal stress, comes on from the topic of money. So we're going to look at that. The reason why we're going to do that is because oftentimes if we turn on the television, if we listen to the radio, if we go to the movies, we are always presented with different pictures and images of what it means to be successful, what it means to be wealthy, what it means to have money, and what you should do with that money. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was a show with an individual named Robin Leach. He had a fantastic accent. I'm not going to attempt to try it because they would just record it and use that against me later on this year. But he had the show of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, where he talked about people's champagne wishes and caviar dreams, where you didn't have a yacht, you had 2 yachts because you were just that wealthy. And you had a gold drinking fountain that shot your favorite beverage out of it. And then put on display were these people with opulent lifestyles, and this is what we should strive for, and this is what we should be. And that started back then, but shows like that have continued on, whether you watch shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians. We won't ask you to raise your hand if you do watch those shows because we will publicly mock you, but we know some of you watch that show. Some of you are really involved in the Real Housewives of whatever city. There's different shows that we watch that put displays of pictures of wealth on, and we think, man, I wish my life would look like that somewhat. There's Also, other things out there that influence the way that we think about money. One of my favorite movies is The Wedding Singer, Adam Sandler, late 90s. There's this scene in there where he is applying for a job because he is a wedding singer for a living, which obviously makes no money at all. And he's pining for and in love with a girl who's engaged to a guy who makes lots of money, so he decides to go to a bank to apply for a job. In the scene, the person asks him, "Do you have any experience?" And Adam Sandler's character responds, "No, sir, I have no experience, but I'm a big fan of money. I like it, I use it, I have a little, I keep it in a jar on top of my refrigerator. I like to put more in that jar, that's where you come in." Some of us, that's how we view money. We have little of it, we want more of it, we like it, we keep it in a jar on our refrigerator. There's other proverbs out there in music. Dr. John has a song where he talks about everybody wants to get rich right away, right away, right away, right away. The proverb group of the Wu-Tang Clan informs us that cash rules everything around me. Philosopher Snoop Dogg once said, he has his mind on his money and his money on his mind. Thank you very much. I know I could count on one of you. And then Biggie Smalls informed us, you have mo money, you will have mo problems. And the kids today just like to tell us, we just simply need to make it rain. It's not real money. Last service, like people bombarded like I was actually going to give out real money. No, they're fake. Anyways, so what we're doing today is we're going to talk about money because we have a lot of things that inform us and tell us how we should view money, how we should use it, how we should value it. But as we do that, I want to give us a little bit of a disclaimer because what today is not going to be, inform you on that, is the first thing is I'm not after your money. I'm not here to try and guilt you. I'm not here trying to bait and switch you, trying to convince you to do anything else. The church isn't after your wallet. So I know oftentimes when we talk about money in church, it's one of the things that rises tension and makes us anxiety, like we shouldn't have this conversation. But just to let you know, if you're here for the first time, you're thinking, oh great, I'm church, first sermon I hear, it's on money. I knew that's all they're about. No, you could keep your wallet in your back pocket, in your purse, or wherever you keep it. But today we are going to be looking at what God says, how we approach money. And so today is simply not a sermon on giving, although what we learn about today will obviously have an impact of how we use money and then how we use it within the church. So we could say we could tithe, for those of you who are new to Christianity, exploring, Christians tithe to God, saying that they take the first 10% of what they receive and give it back to God as an act of obedience, as an act of worship. It's the first thing that we do as Christians. We say, I'm not going to squeeze in giving or I'll fit in giving later, but it's the first thing that I'm going to commit to in response to what God has done for me. Even just that's how it plays out practically for my family and I. The first thing that we do once we get paid is give to the church. Before we pay the mortgage, before we do anything else, we give to God first. So what we'll look at today will have some impacts of how we view money and maybe respond to it within the church. But there is a sense where we could tithe and do that thing, but still miss the boat completely for what God intends for us when we approach our money. We could tithe and give to the church and be generous towards Jesus, but still have money with a tight grip on our hearts, constantly on our minds and making us feel weary in the soul. So this isn't just a sermon on giving, and it's also not a sermon simply on the perils of money. Proverbs speaks to topics such as inequality, greed, materialism, overconsumption, debt, misuse of money for corrupt purposes, and we'll address some of that. But Proverbs does speak to money a lot, how we use it and how we accumulate it and how that is actually a good thing. So when we are talking about money today, don't hear me say that it's a bad thing to want a house or to have the ability to provide for a family, but having things in the proper perspective. So today, as we get going, I'm going to ask 8 diagnostic questions for us. 8 questions that might maybe reveal to us that we have a misappropriated view of money within our lives, or maybe money has more power and influence in our lives than we maybe would want to acknowledge and admit. And that's the reason why we're looking at the topic of money this week. And so question number 1, do you constantly think about money even when it is not necessary or relevant to the situation? Number 2, does your self-worth and happiness primarily depend upon your own financial success or possessions you own? Number 3, Do you feel a sense of emptiness or dissatisfaction despite having sufficient financial resources? Number 4, do you compare your wealth or possessions to others, feeling envious or inadequate if you perceive others having more? Number 5, are you constantly chasing money regardless if it aligns with your genuine needs? Number 6, are you afraid of losing your wealth or becoming financially insecure to the point where it causes significant distress? Number 7, do you feel a deep sense of anxiety or discomfort when spending money, even on necessary, reasonable expenses? And then lastly, are you reluctant to give or share your money even when you have the ability to help others in need? So what we're after today is provide resolution and solution for our minds and for our hearts if we answered yes to any of those questions. The problem that we face, as we see in the book of Proverbs, is not money itself, but how we use it, how we treat it, how we value it, and how we elevate it to a certain place within our lives. Our hope today as we explore the scriptures that we would correct the thinking that we have, thinking that money can buy us power or comfort or control or recognition, security or importance. I'm willing to bet that we all had at least one yes on that list of questions, if not all of them. Because we know that in the last few years, there has been a lot of fear surrounding our finances as individuals. Fears of recession, feeling the pains of inflation. There's panic and anxiety that have dominated our conversations, our news stories, and driven many decisions because of fear regarding it. In fact, I know that for many of us, there's a disconnect in our minds between our current reality and what we think we ultimately need. Bankrate did a survey polling a large section of Americans, and it said, on average, Americans say that they would need to earn at least $200,000 and $300,000 a year to feel financially secure, meaning almost making $250,000 a year to feel financially secure. And then they would need $400,000 and $300,000, meaning almost $500,000, to feel rich. But then the very next line in the survey said, most Americans make around $56,000 a year. So do you see the tension that we begin to create within ourselves, thinking, I need $250,000, I need $500,000 to feel secure, to feel rich, and yet our income is nowhere near that. So it just inherently creates a tension within inside of us of saying, I don't feel secure, I don't feel safe, I don't feel comfortable, I don't have what I need, I don't have what I want. And that's when we begin to maybe view money in a way that God wouldn't intend for us to do. There's many of us in this room who have felt the pinch of trying to purchase a home or have the inability to because of prices. We feel the pinch every time we go to the gas station to fill up our gas tanks to travel to work. We are having to take other types of vacations because we can't afford new ones. Or simply going to the grocery store, the basket doesn't get as filled as it once did with the increased prices. Many of us are saying that our George Washingtons and our Abraham Lincolns aren't going as far as they once did. And it has an impact on our outlook and our perspective on life. So the book of Proverbs today is going to give us a different aspect, a different way to actually view our finances, our money, our wealth. And the wisdom would tell us this, and that's the main idea of today's sermon, will be this. Wisdom says, pursue Christ, not cash. That's what we'll see in our sermon today. So we're going to see the goal of what God would have for his people when it comes to the idea of money and wealth, all these things. So if you're with me, Proverbs 3, starting in verse 9. Solomon writes, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine. So this very first proverb that we're going to look at today, speaking to money, it says, honor the Lord with your wealth. And in the context in which it was written, if you're familiar with the book of Proverbs, earlier in chapter 3, just a handful of verses earlier, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. So it's not surprising to me, knowing just the human nature of our hearts, when we're told to trust in the Lord with everything, that then the very first thing that Solomon begins to target and go after is the thing that often wants to take control of our hearts, money. So one of the best ways to know that we are trusting the Lord with all our hearts is, are we honoring God with what he's given us. Because notice what it says in verse 9, honor the Lord with your wealth. It's not a matter of if you have wealth. He's saying whatever you have in your wallet, in your bank account, in your 401k, whatever possessions you have, your net worth, whatever it is, as big as it may be or as small as it may be, whatever you have, honor the Lord with it. So it's not a matter of if you have it or you don't. And I love how it says, honor with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce, meaning this. There is that expectation, that communication, that there would be this giving and this generosity back towards God for what he has given you. But that doesn't let us then off the hook to do whatever else we want with the other 90%, right? It's like, okay, I went to church this morning and I put my offering in the basket. So God, that's your part. Now I'm going to do whatever I want with the rest of my money. That wouldn't necessarily be the most honoring to the Lord, is what Solomon is saying. That everything that we have, from the first fruits, from our tithes, from our offerings, and then to everything else that we own, everything else that we have, we're to honor the Lord with it. Thinking in mind, is this how God would want me to steward this resource that he has given me? Because notice how he says in verse 10, he responds to continuing sustaining life for us. We honor him with our wealth, with our giving, of our produce, and look at what it says God does in response. He says, your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats bursting with wine. Now, oftentimes, some of us might get really nervous when we read this verse because we've seen how other teachers or books or other, maybe even some churches have twisted and distorted this verse to say, if you give, look at what God will do for you. Now, this isn't a prosperity gospel saying that if you give to this, God will match it, then you're just going to live a life of abundance, because for many of us, we don't know that's not the reality in which we live. So this isn't a promise from God saying if you do this, you're going to have this overabundance of barns filled with plenty and vats bursting with wine. But it does speak to the contentment that we will have within our hearts, knowing that whatever we have from God will leave us feeling content. Every week this summer, as we walk through the book of Proverbs on Monday morning when our staff meets, we've been taking time to look at the different passages that we're going to study together as a church on Sunday. And we just say, what does it seem like God's teaching us? What would God want us to reflect upon and think about as a church body this week? And we almost do a mini devotional as a church staff on Monday morning looking at these different passages. And somebody said it, and it was really insightful this week about this passage. I was saying how oftentimes from a Christian perspective, though we may have little, when we look at what we actually do have because we recognize who it comes from and we want to honor God with it, even if it seems very little to a worldly standpoint, we see that it's over in abundance and we see it as our barns filled with plenty. We have more than we need, more than enough. God's been so gracious to fill our lives with these things. And so it's a shift of perspective and contentment and enjoying of what God has actually given us rather than allowing the world standards to define what is surplus. And I think that's a really beautiful picture of there is a sense in which if we can be so content with what God has given us, even if it looks little from the outside, we could still have a perspective that God has met our needs over in abundance. So the first thing that scriptures teach us about how to handle our money and our wealth, the first thing would be simply to honor the Lord with it. And then the second thing would be is recognize that it's him who it comes from. Proverbs 10:22 says this, the blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. So we need to see, we honor the Lord with what we have, and everything we have comes from him. Our provision comes from above. It is God who is the agent who brings money and wealth. I love Psalm 50 where it talks about how God has the cattle on 1,000 hills. He has more than he will ever need, and if he was in need, he wouldn't even tell you to begin with, because who are you to help provide something for God? He has everything he needs. He has everything he wants, but he also so graciously gives from his abundance to us. And it's important to think about that. And I know in a few weeks we're going to talk about what it looks like to have a biblical work ethic and how do we approach work with a biblical mindset. But what this passage is telling us here is that God is actually the one who brings wealth and money. Because we all know the individual who does work hard and doesn't get very far, right? Or maybe the person who does work hard for selfish gain. But we need to see that wealth comes from God above. So it's not just simply hard work saying that if you work really hard, you're going to be wealthy. Some of the hardest working people I know in my life have been extremely hard jobs early in the morning, late at night, working extraneous circumstances and not acquiring wealth. But what we do get comes from God. Ray Ortland, in his commentary on the book of Proverbs in this section, says this, God does not feel one particular emotion about the American dollar, but he feels emotions for us. God will use a lot of things in our lives to prepare us for the future work in us and what he wants for us. Things that come from God, whatever they are, is what makes us rich. Whatever it is, the amount, whatever it looks like. So those are if we're going to think about having a biblical perspective from money and wealth from the book of Proverbs this morning, those are the first two things that we need to see, is that whatever we do have, whatever we have been given, first we honor God with it, and secondly, we recognize it comes from him. And now we're going to look at some of the problems that keep us from actually operating out of that, or even believing that, or problems that keep us from seeing that on a day-to-day basis. The very first problem that we see is superficial living, and we see this in Proverbs 14, verses 20 and 21. Solomon writes, "The poor is disliked even by his neighbor, but the rich has many friends. Whoever despises his neighbor is a sinner, but blessed is he who is generous to the poor." So what Solomon is wanting to warn us against for having a proper view of money and a proper view of wealth is protecting us and guarding us from the idea that money can cause us to see people wrongly, to simply see them as commodities to be used or discarded based upon what they can or cannot do for us. The poor, disliked, cast aside. They can't offer us anything. Yet we'll gladly rally around the rich despite potential downfalls. We like them, or we ourselves pursue wealth to be liked because we like the idea that we might be able to do something for somebody. Solomon is warning us against that. He says this money and wealth can create quite a bit of fair-weathered friends. You know, when that last check clears, those friends can no longer be found, right? There's always stories about individuals who either, when they hit the lottery or they come into a big inheritance, what is usually one of the first phone calls that they get? Like a long-lost relative, right? Like, "Hey, so-and-so, I'm your third cousin. We met at a family barbecue back in 19 so-and-so. We had a great time. Do you remember that?" "No." "Well, I do, and it really meant a lot to me. And you know what? I'd really like to come see you again." Who are you again? All of a sudden, your neighbor starts lingering on your mailbox. "Hey, how you doing?" Because money, wealth, those things can create superficial living where people are just simply there for what you might be able to do, or you gravitate around people who might do something for you. Solomon is warning us against that. And again, not seeing them as commodities or people to be used, but people made in the image of God. Because look at how he ends verse 21. "Whoever despises his neighbor because maybe they can't offer us something, they can't do something for us, he just calls you flat to your face a sinner." But it says, "Blessed is the one who's generous to the poor, looking out for those around them, living open-handedly, living generously, giving to those around." So that's the first problem. The second problem is the game of comparison, and this is in Proverbs 15:16. "Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it." So Solomon here isn't saying that there's anything inherently wrong with wealth or treasure, but it can't be the highest value and it can't be your main driver, because he says better to have little and have the fear of the Lord reigning, ruling, controlling your life. If you remember what we studied the first week of Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of understanding how we receive wisdom, how we grow in relationship with God. The fear of the Lord is the foundational thing. And he's saying it's actually better for you to have little and have that right relationship with God than all these riches and no relationship with God. And it teases us out in a different way because it says, better is this than that. So presses a question for us this morning. If we're honest, if we look at what drives us, if we look at what our mind is consumed about with thinking, is it better to have that relationship with God, or would you rather have great treasure and trouble? This proverb kind of drives at the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, right? If you're familiar with that statement. It refers to striving to match or exceed the social and material possessions of one's neighbors or peers, right? It describes the desire to maintain a comparable lifestyle, wealth, or status as others in your community or social circle. The phrase is often used to describe the pressure we put on ourselves or our families to compete with people to keep pace with them, whether they're perceived success or possessions around them. And we could think of that because of how the verse starts, where it says better. Better is a word that brings out envy, brings out restlessness. We always want something better. And it starts at a really young age, right? If you think back to the playground, a person shows up with the right shoes, or the latest jeans, or the cool JanSport backpack, like all those things that were like the status symbols of those days. I need to have that. I need to look like that. I need to possess that so I can be in. And if only that desire that was in us back then dissipated and disappeared, but it only gets stronger and takes more control of us as we get older, right? But it's with things that are far more expensive and things that are far more showy nowadays. So Proverbs is warning us against looking at others, what they have, and seeing that it is better and longing for it. And we've all done this because we've all either thought it, or maybe even some of us has even said, like, my life would be better if I had that, what they have. And so for me, I'm a total like tech geek nerd. Like I've always wanted the newest phone, the nicest TVs, all those things. I've got to have it. I go to your house and you've got something bigger or better than mine. I'm like, I got to get that to keep up. I got to have something that is nice. You invite us over for the Super Bowl party. I'm like, that's the coolest thing ever. I got to have that TV. I've got to have those snack makers, whatever those things are called. Microwave? That's gross. We don't do that. But it's warning against this idea that we see what others have and we feel like we have to compete to keep up with it. And so here are some silly things that we have spent money on in our lifetimes that are a big portion of money that end up sitting in a trash pile somewhere in just a short amount of time. So think about it. 1968. Some of you can go back there. I wasn't there yet. You can tell me about it later. But 1968. You know what came out in 1968? The very first color TV. Ooh. The grass on the field for the big sporting event, green. It's not gray anymore. I could see the colors of their jerseys, the show's vibrant colors. Our old black and white TV, it's just not gonna do anymore. Gotta have it. Contentment is tied to this possession. So something that back in that day cost $320. In today's economy, that would be about $2,800. But most of us today would look at that like, man, I don't even think I can get Netflix on that thing. Like, wait, I don't even have a remote control. I got to stand up and turn the dial? Like, what are you talking? Like, again, we spent money on these things, and now, just a few short years later, it's worthless. It's obsolete. 1973, the car of the year was the Monte Carlo. Ooh, shiny, pretty. Ooh, go fast. Go far. Base price is about $3,400, which would be about $23,000 today. But you know what? I get into it today. I'd be like, where's your GPS? Where's the automatic locking doors and the automatic windows? I don't want to have to hand crank that thing. Don't you know how hot it is? That little metal knob gets hot. There's things that we spend our money and go after to keep up with. Like, we're going to watch it today. I know you've done it. Just confess it now. You've walked out of church on Sunday and you saw somebody pull up in the brand new car. You're like, man, I wish I had that. My car's like dingy. It's not just dingy because I haven't washed it in a while, but the paint's peeling. That looks nice. My life would be better if. 1982, the CD player came out. Cost about $1,000 back then, which would be about $3,000 today. But you know what would happen if we went back to our kids' ministry and I handed them a CD? They're like, is this a Frisbee? Is this one of those things that my mom always wants me to put my drink on? They have no idea what a CD is. But we had to have it, and the big speakers to play the music. 1997, the DVD player came out. $700 then, about $1,300 now. And I remember, it's the silliest thing. Like, I didn't know. I think they were just trying to trick us because I didn't like reading. So the idea of like chapters, I didn't like chapters. But you know what had chapters? DVDs. You remember the DVD? Like, I want this scene. I got to go to this chapter. But you have to like scroll through the wicked menu, and there's no easy scroll button like there is nowadays on streaming services. I have to get up and get down and put a new disc in if I want to watch something new. I can't switch to it as easy. But my life will be so much better if I have this. And then one that's a little bit closer. Back in 2007, the world changed probably for the worst. the iPhone came out. About $500, about $750 today. Just think about how many hundreds and thousands of dollars we have spent trying just to keep up with the latest technology because the camera's new, or there's no like home button anymore. It just recognizes my face. It's the coolest thing. The camera's better. I've got to keep up. We play the comparison game. What I have, I can't be content with because out there is something better. Proverbs would warn us against that. The third problem that we have is the fool's errand. In Proverbs 28:22, it says this: a stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. This proverb is describing a person who is eager to accumulate wealth, eager to hastily work to accumulate and amass all these things for them without realizing the potential downfall of doing it. They're willing to cut corners, deny justice, live in a way in which they lack compassion and care for other people around them. The opposite of what Proverbs lays out for us of honoring the Lord with our wealth. The people who often feel the pain and the pinch of this proverb coming forward is our families, our kids. Because we are so busy pursuing, building our resume, chasing our career, chasing status. It's one thing to hastily work hard to provide for the family, but it's another thing to hastily work hard just to make another zero or comma or impact on your bank account. So we cut corners and cut time with the people that matter to us, our family, our children, or even our church family. You know how it's heartbreaking to hear people saying, I don't have time for this Jesus thing, or I don't have time for getting involved in a group or developing relationships, or I don't have time for serving because my work keeps me too busy. This proverb might be one we reflect on and consider. Because what it's getting at is that no poverty will come upon him. Maybe it's not in the means of financial or possessions, but you might be poverty in all the areas that really matter. And the last problem Proverbs lays out for us is that it's never enough. Proverbs 11:24. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. So what we're told here is quite counterintuitive. It says those who grow in generosity, those who grow rich, are those who live open-handedly and give freely, give generously. The imagery here gives us to the idea of somebody who scatters seed. Like earlier this year when you're planting your yard or planting your garden, you generously scattered the seed to hopefully have things grow and be life-giving and beautiful and all the things that you're hoping for. And not only did you just spread the seed generously, but you watered it generously. Like you soaked it. You always made sure it had everything it needed and you gave an abundance to it. That individual who sees money and treats money that way, the proverb says, grows all the richer. Not hoarding, not keeping. But for those who do hold, those who are stingy or selfish, it says here, they are the ones who actually end up poor. Not only that, but they suffer the desire for more. There's America's first billionaire, John Rockefeller, he's attributed to this quote, but there's a question that he was asked saying, how much money does it take to make a person happy? His response, just a little bit more. Because it's never enough. I'm never satisfied. The not enough mentality always has new goals, new aspirations to come, because once we achieve what we set out before, it's no longer adequate. The pleasure and the satisfaction that is derived from it wanes, and so we need something new, something better, something more. And so Proverbs teaches us that through these ways and more others, that foolishness is pursuit of money because it ultimately leads to idolatry. It leads to greed. And it reveals a heart that truly does not believe or follow after Jesus. So what is the proper response? What is the correction to these problems? It's considering who God is and what God has done for you. Proverbs 11:4 says this, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. The Beatles once said they don't care too much for money because money can't buy them love. You could also say money can't buy you salvation. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath. When we stand before God, give an account for our lives, we cannot just say, well, how much is the judge and jury going to cost to get me off of this one? The only way to stand before God is with righteousness. Riches don't let us off the hook. Accumulating wealth and material possessions alone isn't sufficient for true security and ultimately salvation. You see, the reason why we're often driven by material wealth and pursuing possessions, comfort, status, all those types of things, is because there's an ache inside of every one of us. It's because you and I, apart from God, are spiritually bankrupt. And we take things like possessions, like people, like things of this earth, and try and satisfy our soul with things that were never meant to do that. So you and I are ultimately spiritually bankrupt before God, and we have no way of means of being delivered apart from righteousness that we don't have. So where does this righteousness come from? The Apostle Paul tells us this in 2 Corinthians 8. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. You see, Christ was rich up in heaven, and he gave it up and came to our spiritual poverty and deposited his wealth on our behalf to make us righteous and to make us wealthy in all the means that actually matter. God left the comforts of heaven to come to us, spiritually bankrupt, poor, and needy sinners, and gave his entire life, his wealth, to make us righteous, to make us spiritually rich, to make us one with him. You see, this is one of the things that I love to consider about when we think about Jesus, not just simply somebody who has done this work for us, and that's a great thing, but we also think about how Jesus is an example, but he's more than just an example. But there's one interaction in Jesus' life and ministry that I think about when it comes to money and wealth and possessions, and it's actually early on in his life and ministry. He goes out into the wilderness and he's tempted by Satan in 3 different ways. And one of the ways in which he is tempted is when that we are tempted with every single day when we wake up and we start thinking and we scroll through Instagram and we see an ad thinking my life will be better if I have that. Because what does Satan tempt him with in Matthew 4, 8 through 10? It says this. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. He says, look at all the wealth, look at all the glory, look at all these wonderful things. And he said, all these things I will give to you. Possession, wealth, status, power, notoriety. They're all yours if you bow down to me and worship me. But Jesus said, be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. So not only did he set this wonderful example of saying, I'm going to pursue to honor the Lord with all that I do, pursue Christ, pursue Christ-likeness, pursue holiness, pursue godliness over the wealth of this world. And not only did he set that example, but he also, like I said, he deposited his wealth into our account to make us right with him. So this is what changes us, and this is how we can begin to see how we honor the Lord with our wealth, how we begin to see him as the one who is the giver of it all, as we reflect upon what he's done for us. You see, this is what changes us and enables us to be a generous people, to honor the Lord. You see, one does not need to be rich to be generous. One simply needs to be changed by Jesus, who changes our greedy, taking, hoarding type hearts and changing them into joyful, generous people. So the wisdom would say to us this morning, pursue Christ and not cash. At the end of the book of Proverbs in chapter 30 is recorded the only prayer throughout the entire book. There's a lot of things that talk about what we should pray for or how God responds to when people pray, but there's not an actually recorded prayer except for these few verses at the end of chapter 30, at the beginning of chapter 30. It says this, 2 things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. It's amazing how in God's sovereignty, how he orchestrates things for us as a church often. If you think about it, just last week, we studied the power of our speech and the power of how we use our words. And one of the only things that we see prayed for in the book of Proverbs is asking God, hey, protect me from using my words in a certain way. And then pivots to start saying, God, teach me to live in a certain way with my finances. And now all of a sudden we're looking at those two things back-to-back weeks. I always just think that's great when God does that. But essentially what the author of this proverb is writing is saying we need to be protected against two of our temptations. One is that we would become so rich that we would begin to think like, I don't really need God. I'm pretty comfortable. And if I need something, if I want something, I'll just buy it. I don't really need God. But then it's also praying for protection against the temptation of maybe not having enough to where we would even think about taking control and putting things into our own circumstances and taking and robbing. And so what I want us to do this morning is read these verses together as a prayer as a church body. And the reason why I want to do that is this. It's because the two ways in which we are the most tempted to sin and stray and depart from God's ways is often in the way that we speak, like we studied last week, and also the way that we use and treat our resources and the money that we have. So I want us to read this biblical prayer together, that God will begin to do this work in us and through us and for us, that we would be able to pursue Christ and what he wants for us in our lives. So if you wouldn't mind, the verses will be on the screen. I want you to read them with me. It says this: 2 things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. What this prayer is after is this deep desire to be fully content in who God is and what God has given you and how God has provided for you in the biggest ways that you need, not just physically or monetarily, but ultimately spiritually. Let us pray. Father, we give you thanks for this morning, that we've recognized that you are the one who gives us everything that we have. So we confess that we often take for granted what you've given us, even take credit for what you've given us, or simply we take advantage of it and use it as a tool to elevate ourselves. Or God, we look down upon those who don't have any, and we improperly elevate others who have it, thinking that that's a sign of your blessing or your love. You love them more than the rest of us. So God, I pray that you would help protect us from erring in any of these ways. Would you give us the right perspective of how to see and treat the resources in which you've given us, that we would be able to honor you with what we have. We confess the times and ways in which we've neglected to do so. We confess that our generosity isn't always motivated by the right means. We confess that we hoard and hang tightly to because we don't fully trust in you. And God, we know that it's complicated and there's different circumstances and different situations for each of us in this room, but you're calling all of us to honor you with what we have. So help us to be a people who does that. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.